Share this lesson tonight, as if you could not tell by my promoting of it on Facebook. I had this idea to do this probably about a year or so when we started this the teaching series, and I was excited, and I went to Joseph and said, I've got this great idea of doing church history dive, and he was all excited about it and whatnot, and he said, you should do it. I went to Brandy and I said, Brandy, I want to do this thing. I'm not ready for it yet. And she goes, sounds like a terrible idea. So one of my goals tonight is to try to impress my wife. But tough job. But tonight, as you're looking at church history, it's going to be impossible for us to get all the way into the details like I would love to. It's an incredibly important topic. But hopefully what I can do is give you a little bit of a context, a historical context on our faith. And hopefully something will connect with you to help us appreciate what we have and the price. We know the price that Christ paid, but the price that previous generations paid for what we have and the freedoms we get to express. So, travel back with me. It is AD 30 or so, and a group of about 120 Jewish men and women are huddled together in the upper room in a seemingly insignificant and dusty, faraway end of the Roman Empire. A few weeks earlier, they were a scattered, shell-shocked bunch, despondent of hope, because the one on whom they put their hope had been shockingly and degradingly executed. Now, fast forward about 300 years to 325 AD, and it's the first ecumenical council of the Universal Catholic Church, and it's just concluded. Now, assembled are bishops from all across the Roman Empire, and they're convened to resolve a rising heresy that's going to be known as Arianism. And in doing so, they've set forward what's called the Nicene Creed, the basis of Orthodox Christianity going forward. Now, central to this controversy was, in essence, the very same question that Jesus had posed to Simon Peter some 300 years earlier: who do you say that I am? Now, this question was not going to be put to bed easily and quickly as they had hoped for, but for now, they'd done their work and they relaxed and chilled. And the gathered bishop marveled at this great privilege that they'd been now extended and afforded. And many praised God for the favor that he granted them. There were literal shock, some of them, as they marveled that they're now in the dining court of the emperor himself. Emperor, and a man who will be known to history as Constantine the Great. Just a generation prior to this, they endured some of the worst persecution empire-wide that had been mandated under Diocletian. And to be here in the emperor's court must have seemed to be the ultimate of surrealism, if that's a word. To others, this may have seemed to be the pinnacle in a long-fought struggle against the world, against pagan belief. How do we get to this point? You see, for many brothers and sisters had paid the ultimate price, and in them the very words of Christ were true that he spoke to John in Revelation. They had triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their life so much as to shrink from death. Revelation 12, verse 1. So history, I love history. I'm getting to love history more and more, but history is a study of people, times, and places, and a conflict of noteworthy note rises, and you write it down, and it gets history. And as we go through a little bit of church history tonight, we're going to go through 300 years, we're going to look at some heroes of some buildings, some problems that they face. And so tonight, we're going to take a look, I've got to control this, we're going to take a look at the world that the church was born into. We're going to take a quick look at the growth and the expansion of the church, some of the problems they face, and some key figures in the early church. And we're going to take a quick look, if we can, at the transition to the Christian Roman Empire. And then we'll talk about church life and the major impact on society. Okay. This is weird having the presentation behind me. I'm not used to that. You have a handout. And before we get started, there are some key vocabulary terms that we should be familiar with. I am not going to go over all of these vocabulary terms. but you have them as reference here. Some of these are part of a common vernacular, but some of the original meaning has been lost over time. Words like Catholic that I used in my introduction, it simply means universal, as in the Universal Catholic Church. And Orthodoxy, I used to think that was like, the Eastern Orthodox Church, but Orthodox simply means adhering to conventional norms. Heresy or deviant teachings. And paganism, another word that I use, doesn't necessarily mean you're a wicked, vile unbeliever. You may be, and maybe that's a pagan, but it's simply adhering to the pantheon of pagan gods that the Romans adhere to. Okay? Another word we're going to talk about that is bishop, which is over time got to have a different meaning that we see initially in the New Testament. Simply in the New Testament, it's simply an overseer or an elder. And over time, it came to represent, about the 2nd century, the lead pastor, the lead elder in the church in a major metropolis. Okay? Move on. So, let's talk about the background that early church was born into. I need to stop doing this. So, the background of the early church. So, we can't think about early church history without considering the background of the nation of Israel. And as we know, the Israelites, or Jews, were sent into captivity in about the 6th century BC into Babylon. And from Babylon, the Jewish diaspora spread into the Median and Persian Empire, because the Babylonians were conquered by those kingdoms, and later into the Greek Empire, right? Whereas before they were clustered in Judea proper. Now, in 325 BC, Alexander the Great, around that time here, literally conquers the world and Hellenizes the Mediterranean, which means that he effectively spread the Greek language and Greek thought and Greek ideology across the Mediterranean. In this time frame, the Old Testament, or Torah, begins to be expressed in the Parthian, the Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, and alongside Greek philosophy. And many people who didn't have an exposure to the Word of God at the time got exposed to the Bible, to the Torah. And so you have many Gentiles gathering in the synagogues, listening to the Word of God being preached, because the truth struck a chord in their hearts, and they were known as the God-fearers. Right? No, many of them would not go through the entire process of being circumcised and eating kosher food, but they adhered to the moral law, and they came because it fulfilled something deep in their souls. Now, this forms an important basis, because these were the people that we see Paul in the book of Acts going into the synagogues in cities across the Roman Empire, and he targeted these people because they had a basis, and they became people that were ready converts, waiting for Christ and the truth of Christ. Now, in 146 BC, Rome assumed Greece into the Roman Empire and continued to establish a system of laws and that was universal across the Mediterranean. So you had a common language of Greek being spread, accompanied by Roman law, safe roads, and now the entire Mediterranean world was connected. Interestingly, of course, Latin is the dominant language in Italy proper and in Rome, but Greek was spread all across the empire. In fact, a lot of slaves spoke Greek. A lot of slaves were educated people that were brought into Italy proper to tutor the Roman aristocrat. And the early makeup of the church, in Rome particularly, they spoke Greek, because that was what the slaves spoke, and most of the church were the lower class. And so that's an interesting fact that changes later on. Now, consider, if you would, the geographical location of Judea, in Jerusalem in particular. And much of you have thought about this, okay? Set betwixt the three major continents, right there, the crossroads between Africa, Europe, and Asia. It's almost as if God had a plan all along for the gospel. And we know that in just the right time, Christ came and he died for the ungodly. Okay? Now, if we go on to into Acts 2, we see there's already a kind of this ready environment, this ripe environment for people traveling to Jerusalem to celebrate Pentecost when the church gets started in Acts chapter 2. And we see in Jerusalem gathered people from all over the world hearing their language being spoken. You know, and the Acts 2 lists all of these nations, and we see where these nations are formed. Now, interestingly, no one is mentioned from Greece because, well, it wouldn't have been a big deal for some guy from Corinth or Athens to hear his language being spoken because Greek was a common language of the Mediterranean. But you know, we can probably fairly well assume that there are people from Greece proper there at Pentecost also. So, the next thing we'll talk about is we'll consider the growth and the expansion of the early church. Literally, from starting from Jerusalem all the way to India, this is about the 4th century, to Nubia, which is current day Ethiopia and Sudan, and all the way to Britain. Okay. All right. So by the end of the 1st century, the church has started in Jerusalem. Sorry, one doesn't work on this. And then expanded to Antioch and to Rome proper. We'll move forward here a little bit. I get caught up in my notes. I'm going to let you guys in a little bit into my kitchen. I've got the presentation in front of me, which is why I keep scrolling in front of me. I've got my notes, and I've got that behind me. So now you guys know why I'm turning it around so much.
You good, bro?
Come on.
Good stuff.
So, you know, the church grew rapidly in the first couple of centuries, and I love this quote by Tertullian. You know, Tertullian's one of my favorite early church fathers, and Tertullian said in the 3rd century, "We're but of yesterday, and yet we've filled all the places to which you belong: your cities, your islands, your forts, your towns, your exchanges, your military camps themselves, tribes, town councils, the palace, the senate, the marketplace. We've left you nothing but your temples." That's kind of like a minister like throwing up and talking smack. Like, look, man, we came in here and we dominated you. We're taking over. That was Tertullian style. But what he said was true. The church is growing in an incredible way. Similar remarks were made by church fathers like Origen and others to show how expansive the church grown. And it's really difficult to place a number on the population of the church, but by the 4th century, it is estimated the church was probably about 10 to 12% of the Roman Empire, which may not seem like a big deal to you, but I mean, can you imagine if 10 to 12% of the city, were fired up and unified and making a difference in Christian life? And that's what the church was. They seemed larger than they actually were because they were concentrated in the urban centers. And so in a place like Rome, it was probably greater. In fact, we know that in Antioch, John of Antioch commented that by the early 4th century, half of Antioch had been converted to Christianity. Now, Antioch is important because Antioch is the first place that the church was established strongly amongst Gentiles. And Antioch is the 2nd or 3rd largest and most important city of the Roman Empire. We know that Paul and Barnabas started from there and launched their early missionary journeys from Antioch. Now, from Antioch, the faith spread across to Asia Minor, which is current-day Turkey, and then it also spread east into Edessa in Mesopotamia by the 2nd century. Now, this is important because this becomes an important jumping-off point, and we won't touch much of what goes on in the east tonight, because the history is just not as well documented as what we have in the west. But this becomes an important jumping-off point for later missionary work further east, like much further east, all the way to China. All right. Now, this didn't happen in the first 3 centuries of the church. This happened on into the 5th and 6th centuries. But the faith reached that far reached such that the Mongols encountered Christians in their conquest, in the 12th, or so century, right? So Armenia in the 3rd century was converted, and Armenia actually, before Rome, became the first state to formally adopt Christianity as a state religion. The faith continued to spread into Arabia, and tradition actually holds that India was reached by the Apostle Thomas in his lifetime, which is, amazing when you think about it. Look where Jerusalem is on the map, and and tradition holds that Thomas was martyred in India. We certainly know that by the 2nd century, a guy named Pantheus was there in India and established the Holy Church. Now, as we move into Africa, the church was first established in Africa, in Egypt. And Egypt, again, is another important center. It's, again, the 2nd or 3rd largest city in the Roman Empire. But it's also this great center of culture, learning, and, Alexandria in particular. The city was founded by Alexander the Great. And from Alexandria, the church spread south on into what was called Libya back then, but into present-day Sudan and into Ethiopia very, very early. And by 235, 20 bishops from now basically attended a synod or a council of the church. Now, from there, the faith was able to spread across North Africa to Carthage and places like that. And Carthage becomes a very, very important center of the church very early on. That's where Tertullian hails from. So the key early centers of the church. So early on, Jerusalem was of great, great importance. For obvious reasons, the faith started in Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem unfortunately faded from prominence after the Jewish rebellions of AD 70 and AD 30. In fact, the entire province was completely whitewashed over, and the Jews were completely displaced, and it was renamed Palestine, which is the city of the Philistines, as a slap to the Jews in AD 135 by the Emperor Adrian. So it was no longer a prominent center for the church. Now, Antioch in Syria had a first Gentile congregation, as I said earlier, and was the base of Paul and Barnabas' early missions. And Rome was important because, for obvious reasons, it's still important today. But it claims its place of preeminency from later bishops. Okay, Constantinople was an important early center, but not for a timeline. It became earlier after the age of the new Christian Empire. So it would be great if we can get up there tonight and say, you know what, everything was awesome in the first 3 centuries. The churches grew, and there weren't any problems, and everyone was in fellowship with each other. But unfortunately, that's not what happened. They were faced with several problems. There are problems from outside. There are problems from inside. There are problems as we did have in any age of the church. And certainly our brothers and sisters in the first 3 centuries of the church faced that. They had to deal with persecutions. They had to deal with heresy or false teachings. They had to deal with what to do about apostasy and keeping the faith pure. And what do we do about schisms and divisions that rise up within the body? If you're into this sort of thing, there's a great timeline here. I'm not going to discuss this timeline in any detail at all. But it overlaid, there are 2 timelines that covered from the first 500 years or so of the church. And it overlaps the certain emperors, certain church fathers, certain heretics, and it overlaps the ages of persecution that we will talk about in a little bit. The guys, you'll figure this out pretty quickly, with the skulls and crossbones associated with them are the emperors who persecuted. Okay? So let's talk about the first problem I'm going to address tonight, and that is persecution. Now, why was the early church persecuted? Now, shockingly enough, certainly for me when I first got exposed to the material, the early church was persecuted. One of the main reasons was they're viewed as atheists. Maybe that, like, those atheists. You know, I mean, today, you know, it's kind of the opposite, where people persecute you because you believe in God, or people take a dim eye on you and go, you believe in God? Who believes in God anymore? No, but they were persecuted because they didn't hold to, you know, to acknowledging the conventional pagan deities. And that was a problem because people were very superstitious back then, and they believed that, well, this God controls the wind, this God controls the rain, and this God controls the sun, and if you don't pay the proper homage to the gods, then you are in effect subverting society. What's wrong with you? And so the Christians were seen as minimalists in their worship. They didn't offer any sacrifices. People would look at the Christians and wonder, what kind of God do you serve that you don't have to offer any sacrifice to him? And worship? What do you guys meet? In a graveyard? Oh, what's up with that? You know, so people didn't understand the Christians, and they were seen as subverting society and changing the peace of society. Now, along with the misunderstanding, many slanderous rumors started to be perpetuated about the Christians. People would say, well, these guys are meeting in secret, and they did. In the early days, they met not completely in secret, but they met early in the morning. Largely because a lot of the church constituted of the working class and slave. The slave and master would meet together. And they met on Sunday. Well, Sunday was not a holiday until Constantine became emperor and made it so. So if you were going to go to work and you were a slave, you'd go to church first, early in the morning before everyone else got up, and that's when they would have the meeting of the body. So you're going to church and someone hears, hey, where are you going? Well, we were meeting. When? At 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock? Nothing good happens in Rome before sunrise. I mean, Rome was notorious for conspiracies and backstabbing and we've all read Julius Caesar, right? But that was not just in the age of Julius Caesar. That was just a thing in Rome. I mean, it was like, conspiracy admitted. So that cast suspicion on the Christians. But also, they were like, oh, and we're going to this agape feast. And so they're like, you're meeting, so what are you doing? And so people started accusing Christians of things like cannibalism and incest and debaucheries and orgies because they didn't understand what the meaning of the body was all about. And later on, the apologists, the church fathers would write letters to the emperors and the government saying, that's just a bunch of garbage. Don't believe that. That's not true. Now, another reason why the church was persecuted eventually was they threatened to upset the social class structure of society. They ignored all the common conventions. And again, the Roman Empire, if you were a slave, well, like any age, you were not valued at all. But if you were poor, you're also not valued. If you were a woman, you were not valued. I mean, it was an incredibly misogynistic society. I mean, it was crazy. It was maddening how bad it was. And so here are these Christians, and having this worldview that we're all the same under Christ. There's no man, there's no woman, there's no slave, there's no free, there's no barbarian, there's no Stygian. Whoa. Interestingly, I don't think their society tripped out about race like we do in our age. Maybe they did, but probably not the same way like we did. But social class, education, I don't care if your skin tone is the same as mine. Your accent says you're Greek, and I'm Latin. Or your accent says you're Germanic. You're a barbarian. Go take a bath. That was their thing, right? And the Christians blurred those lines. Now, the other thing that marked out Christians was their personal behavior. They were set apart. They were aloof from society because they were devoted to purity. And they avoided the entertainment of the day and the big celebrations, the gladiatorial games, and the their festivals, and the entertainment was filled with lust, and it was also filled with gory bloodiness. And the Christians, and Tertullian again famously wrote a writer called Against the Soul, saying, hey, avoid those things, they're corrupting your soul. Now, can you imagine living in a time where we're not going to go to the movies because it's going to corrupt your soul. We're just not going to go. I don't care what it's rated. And the Christians were marginalized for taking a radical stance. Is we gotta live purely, we gotta live righteously in a corrupt world. That meant something to them, and they died for it. Now, towards the end, petty jealousy became a thing. You know, it wasn't so much a thing in the first maybe century and a half, but by the time of the 4th century, petty jealousy started to rise among certain classes. We're like, those Christians, those guys are making it out pretty good because they're working pretty hard. And in Rome, guess what? About half of the population was on the dole. They were dependent on the state or some benefactor. And the Christians got like, you know what? The Bible tells us, Paul wrote, if man doesn't work, you don't need. And so the Christian work ethic started to make a difference, and so the church leadership was organized and it was effective, and so people started to look at the church or the Christians with mistrust and with jealousy, and that on a high level started to be a reason for persecution. Now, commonly there are 10 ages of persecutions that's traditionally counted. Now, I should note by the early church, and there's always discussion about it, well, the early church, they exaggerated persecution. You know what? If someone gets shot that you know, or someone dies tragically, it's a big deal. So people can cynically say, well, the early church is exaggerated persecution. No, it was real. It was significant. It was people that they loved, okay? And it would be a big deal for us if we lived at that time when people you know were dying, all right? And there were these certainly 10 identified persecutions, but they weren't all empire-wide, and some were carried out in spurious fashion. Some governors were just notoriously really evil about it, while others were just looked at the persecution and that's bad practice. I'm not going to do that. And the first persecution that we see is under Nero in about 64 to 68, because Nero was a madman. And you know, if you guys have seen Upside Down, you know, you're familiar with, you know, the Christians are burning, are burning Rome down, and Nero started, allegedly, and I say that, started this rumor, and that was the time when that was the persecution that the tradition holds that Peter and Paul were martyred. Persecution under Trajan. That was an example where Emperor Trajan, the Antichrist tradition as being one of the greatest emperors, and he by right probably was for what he did for the empire. He didn't outlaw Christianity is outlawed, but he didn't really pursue the persecution of Christians, but a lot of Christians died in this time. You know, people like Ignatius, and a lot of great church fathers died on that. There's some great correspondence between Trajan and his governor from Bithynia, Pliny, that gives us great insight into the persecution. Something to go look for and study. The next one I want to talk about are the persecutions under Decius and Diocletian. The persecution under Decius was the first empire-wide persecution that the church endured. This came in a time where Decius, he was actually only in office for a very short period of time. But this persecution had a devastating impact on the church because, well, one, it was empire-wide, and because the consequences that came out from it. And he was the guy that instituted the idea of emperor worship, right? Hey, you need to worship the state, all right? And if you don't worship the state, and basically what you have to get to worship the state, incense, sorry Dave, I had a little fun with the cloud, and get a certificate to show that you had princely incense, say Hail Caesar, whatever, and go home. Well, in that persecution, many stood up and were martyred in that persecution, but many were like, oh, you know what? Hail Caesar. Maybe I'll repent tomorrow. Or some said, well, I'm not going to do that. But you know what? Governor Marcos over here, I can buy a certificate off of him. And so many bought certificates and kind of somewhat in hiding. Cyprian famously went into hiding during the persecution. But then after the persecution, many repented and wanted to come back to the fold. And so a big schism arose, what to do about those who had lapsed. That became a term, a lapsed believer, after the Grecian persecution. A similar thing happened after the last great persecution on the Diocletian, with a controversy called the Donatist controversy. So how did Christians die in persecution? I mean, these guys were sadistic and deviant in every way, and the afflictions, they varied from beheadings to crucifixions, being fed, being burnt to fire, being fed to wild beasts in the gladiatorial games, hanging, being dragged to death, just incredibly sadistic acts. Sorry, I didn't realize I took the slide. Again, Nero famously, literally used Christians as torches, if you can imagine that, and thought that was great fun. So incredibly suffering that the early Christians endured for their faith. Now, the next problem that the early church endured was false teachings and heresy. We won't go through all these in great detail, but you see early in the Old Testament the entire Judaizing heresy, where basically you're being taught you've got to follow the Mosaic law. This is it. Jesus was just a guy that showed you can follow the Mosaic law perfectly, and that's kind of the savior figure that it represents. Not really divine or anything like that. We see Paul dealing with that. Next, Gnosticism was a belief. We've all heard a little bit about it because even John addressed it a little bit in the New Testament. Basically, it was this dualistic view of the world that says the material world is all bad, and eventually that led to the fact that anything that is created is all bad. So Jesus wasn't really a man, and because he would have flesh, and and so on and so forth. And so Jesus didn't really appear in the flesh. And hey, by the way, if you want to get down with salvation, we got the secret knowledge over here. So come on over here, give us some money, give us some scratch. We'll show you what a real deal is, because Jesus gave us the secret knowledge over here. It's written over here in the Gospel of, whatever, Thomas Martin, whoever it is, right? And these guys had their own set of teachings that they concocted, which is an important reason for the eventual establishment of the canon. And Joseph dealt with that in his teaching midweek a couple months back. The Montanists, these guys were a hyper-charismatic group, making a bunch of false prophets. They were really an interesting bunch. I'd love to say more about them, but I won't for the sake of time. Monarchianism is another heresy that basically they overreacted to what's called a logos theology, and say, well, really the Father and Son are one, and maybe just the Father really suffered a passion, and really crazy stuff. Now, Arianism is the heresy that we're dealing with in the introduction, where the Arians, they basically proposed that the Son was a creature that at one time did not exist. And so that became a big deal for the church, and I see it, that actually stuck around in various forms for decades. They had to deal with that. And these guys really aren't heretics per se, but then there were the desert hermits like Anthony of Egypt that would fight the demons and by the desert by himself and resist temptation. But it was an interesting group of people that actually became the basis for the later monastic group, because someone finally said, you know what, being on the desert by yourself isn't healthy. Be a part of the community and be useful. Okay. My battery's on 7%. Must need to hurry up. Now, there are schisms in the church. There are separations. There are controversies about when to celebrate Easter. There's questions about who has the authority to forgive sin, and that became a lot of issue for who became later on Roman Catholicism, right? We talked about the innovation of the Donatist controversy. These were controversies associated with what is a true church? Are we going to be strictly just rigorous and pure? Are we going to let people back in that have lapsed or made a mistake over here? And so this became a big deal late 3rd century, early 4th century. And in fact, such a big deal that there's a lot of good that came from the emperor being converted to Christianity. But the first case of Christian and Christian persecution happened after Constantine was brought in when he became a Christian, and he went basically and prosecuted the Donatist movement in North Africa because they wanted to hold to a pure view of the faith. Okay. Now, if you think this is a bunch of hooey, why do you care about this heresy? Theologians have got way too much time in their hand. It's important. I want you to think for a second, the first time when you studied the cross. Think for a second if Jesus didn't really appear in the flesh. Think for a second the impact if he really hadn't suffered, if he really wasn't a man, if he couldn't relate to your emotional and physical pain. What that would mean for the effect of the power of the gospel. This is why this is important. This is why these brothers and sisters fought against it so diligently. If Jesus wasn't divine, then how could God connect with me? I mean, it would just be an empty sacrifice in many ways. You'd just be another man. So these things are important to their core in the gospel. Now, the people who rose to face these problems were the early church fathers. We're not going to go through again all of this, but the church fathers can be divided into what we call the apostolic fathers, which are guys like Clement of Rome, Ignatius, and Smyrna. These guys were the guys who were effectively the disciples of the apostles, right? So Clement is interesting because Clement has Clement's writing to the church in Corinth is the first extant writing that we have that survived outside of the New Testament. So that's pretty cool. And he kind of writes to the Corinthian church, rebuking them again for the same things that Paul rebuked them for. Now, if you look through kind of the annals of the church in Rome, they'll claim that Clement is the second or third pope. Well, the papacy really wasn't a thing when Clement was living. And Clement never claimed to be a pope in that regard, but that's an interesting sidebar. That kind of evolved over time. The next set of church fathers are guys like Justin Martyr, who wrote to the emperors and wrote to governments and says, hey, our faith is true and reasonable. They were apologists, which means, it comes from the Latin or the Greek word for apology, which means to give a defense. And so they wrote reasoned, well thought out arguments to say, hey, look, Christ is the hope on which all of wisdom has been waiting for. It's the embodiment of all of these things. Consider what we're all about. Next we have the theologists, guys like Clement of Alexandria and Origen in Alexandria, where these guys really started to go after reaching intellectual. And at this point, the tide started to change intellectually for the church because the intellectual heavyweights, if you would, showed up. And they're like, okay, we're going to put the gospel in context that you guys can understand philosophically. And so a guy like Clement, man, he would study the classics, he'd study philosophy, and he would just lay it down. Origen was an incredibly early scholar, and I mean, just one of the guys just crazy smart. He kept like 7 or so scribes busy. Jerome later said, has anyone ever written all the works that Origen is published? He wrote, he had to compile a parallel study Bible, which is 6 translations of the Bible, Greek to Hebrew altogether. Incredible church father. Tertullian, we talk a lot about Tertullian. Tertullian is known as the father of Latin theology from North Africa. Irenaeus, super important figure. I'd love to go into some really cool stories about all these guys, but hopefully your interest is piqued to go look at some of these names and figure out why these men were so important. My computer's died, so I don't have to worry about that. So the transition to the Christian Roman Empire. So we've talked about Diocletian, and Diocletian actually has this reputation again for being one of the great Roman emperors, right? And he had this tetrarchy set up to manage or to govern parts of the Roman Empire. But in the last 2 years in office, prompted by many people think Galerius, who's Jewish emperor, starts this great persecution against the church. Well, after Diocletian leaves office, the tetrarchy falls apart, and everybody just says, I'm going to go get mine. I'm going to place my flag over here, and I'm going to fight against this guy because Diocletian's not around here to regulate anybody. And things just basically fall apart. Galerius, famously on his deathbed, who was the initiator of the persecution, realizes that this persecution has failed colossally. I've killed a lot of people, and I've gotten no tangible good for it. People in the empire are starting to sympathize and go, wait a second, you're persecuting my neighbor because he's a Christian. And all they're doing is they're going and they're feeding the poor and taking care of the ill that we're ignoring. And these guys are the good moral people in society. This doesn't make any sense. And so people start to sympathize behind Christians. The Christian faith and the Christian way of life it started to win out. And people could see the difference and see the idiocy of the persecution. And on his deathbed, Galerius, sick, literally canceled the persecution and goes, this has failed. Miserably. So all I can do is do your obligation, Christians, and pray to your God that, for the well-being of the state that I might be healed. Amazingly. So Constantine, we all know about Constantine the Great. In 312, Constantine rises to prominence after taking over from his dad. His dad died. He's one of the four emperors. And there's all kinds of, speculation that Constantine concoct the story afterward, but he approaches Rome to conquer Rome from Maxentius, the guy who's actually, ruling in the city of Rome proper, with about half of the army that Maxentius has. And Maxentius destroys all the bridges, and there's a bunch of pontoon bridges by where the Milvian Bridge is. And the night before the battle, allegedly Constantine gets a vision from Jesus, where Jesus gives him the sign, the Chi Rho, says, in this sign, conquer. The Chi and the Rho are the first letters from Greek for Christ. And he goes on to win this amazing battle, and he, from that point on, identified Jesus as his patron God. I think he eventually got it right later on and can kind of clean it up and, got it clearer. But that's a big turning point. A year later, the Edict of Milan legalizes Christianity. All this time, they've been in a legal sect. So even when they were allowed to kind of prosper, they were illegal. And there's a Council of Arles in 314 that dealt with the Donatist controversy. And finally, in AD 325, we see the Council of Nicaea. Okay? And Constantine is baptized on his deathbed around AD 339. Beyond our time scope, in AD 380, Theodosius, Emperor Theodosius, declares Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. So a big change there. Now, what did early church life look like? What did it mean about baptism and liturgy, which is just another fancy word for the order of the church service, righteousness, charity, and morality? Now, early church services. So I was going to read for you an excerpt from Justin Martyr, but I'm going to say that. The church met on Sundays, as we discussed, usually before sunrise, due to the fact that the church is constituted largely of the working class. They have the Lord's Supper, they memorize Jesus, they make collections for the poor, and needy, they read the prophets and the Psalms, and after that, we had prayer and Thanksgiving. In the early days, there was no singing. What? Yeah, believe that? But you know what? We praise God for Ambrose, because that was an innovation of Ambrose, the mid-4th century. Ambrose, get some music up in here, all right? He's off from there. All right? So that's a little snap of what early church services look like. Now, baptism and conversions. In Acts 2, we see some very, very simple directives. Repent, be baptized, you can see your sins. We know what Acts 2 says. Now, as time went along, there got to be a little bit more detailed instructions. You look at something like Didache, like, hey, make sure it's warm, flowing water, and do this, do that. If there's no warm water, make sure you pour water from it. So this is 2nd century, but we started to see some more involved instructions. Make sure you fast, the person that is being baptized, and the person that is doing the baptizing. You got to fast, right there. So did you fast before you get baptized? Just kidding. But this continued to evolve that by the time of the 3rd century, we see schools, formalized school for catechumens or candidates baptism, and these guys would, early on, they take 2 to 3 years studying. Can you imagine something about for 2 to 3 years? I mean, how deep would your theology be before, okay, now we're ready to baptize you? We're going to talk to you about Marcion and Gnosticism. You're gonna have it on straight, Marcos. You're gonna know. We're gonna talk about some Logos theology. All right, they went deep. And later on, they were like, you know what? If you get baptized, I don't know if we can get forgiven of your sins, though. We just wait to get baptized until you're about to die, which is basically when Constantine got baptized. Interesting implications to all that we can't really get into right now. We already talked about society and the impact that it had on the social structure, the demographic evolving over time. And we talked a little bit about how Christian life eventually just commended itself so well to people that would observe it in an amazing, amazing way. Charity, you know, in Roman and Greek society, if you're down on your luck, you're just down on your luck. And you know what? I'm not going to help you because maybe Tommy's down on his luck because you offended Apollo or you offended Jupiter. And if I help him, I'm going to go against Apollo or Jupiter. So, good luck, buddy. That was their attitude. The Christians were like, no. We come from a basis where, you know, we see in the Torah, leave the edges of your field, you know, on harvested for the poor. There's always a consideration for the poor because God cares about every one of us, regardless of how insignificant our downtrodden our lives may seem to us. Right. And the Christian ethic just you know, it embodied that, it demonstrated that in a powerful, powerful way. And that made a huge difference. The organization of the church was amazing in effect in responding to disaster. So they don't love the guy like Neves, you know, whole coordinator. But if I'm right well there. So, we'll go back to reading properly. You know, hopefully tonight, you know, we get to thinking that, you know, the God that is far above time and space is at work in history. You know, God works in time, and hopefully the lesson for us is that God is at work also, not just in their time, but in our time. And God's personally at work in our lives, through trouble and through hardship. At just the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. And God has set the time and places for men to live, to seek, and to find Him. And church history, I think, illustrates that so powerfully. That God is patient, God is loving, God is working in bigger ways. In our life, we may not achieve our goals. You may die. You may die, and your child may never become a disciple in your lifetime. You may not see it. You may not see the fruit of what you do in your lifetime. Many of them didn't see the fruit of what they did, or even what they died for. But God was creating, and God is working for the salvation of men. And in church history, illustrate that God is patient and loving, not wanting anyone to be lost, but that all will be saved and come to knowledge of Him. And so, therefore, facing all dangers, all threats from outside, ravages from inside trying to infiltrate, hardship, troubles, false teaching, persecution, even death itself, in the end, Jesus' words were untrue when He uttered them. And they were untrue when Jesus said them, 2,100 years ago or so. They rang true for the first 100 years of the church. And it really is true that against the church built on the rock that is Christ, the gates of Hades shall never, ever prevail. Thanks for listening. I want to give you guys some resources. Got a collection of books there that I found pretty helpful in my studying the material. Miss Shelley's Church History in Plain Language, the History of Christian Church, I found really good. I found John Oakes' book at the very, very end, and I didn't really get a chance to read it in depth, but I liked the portions I read of it. Fox's Book of Martyrs is a classic, and New Testament Survey fits into the background. I love listening to podcasts. I've got like 10 or 12, I don't know how many podcasts I'm listening to. I need to thank my children and my wife for enduring road trips for listening to the history of Rome and the history of the Christian church, and God knows what else, because I've subjected them to a lot of podcasts. But if you were that kind of learner, great resources that are there right there on your phone to find your space and go in the yard and all that. Thank you very much for listening.
Can you take a couple questions or?
Time for questions? Go ahead.
As far as the first time that the people were lapsed, do you recall how they accepted them back into the fold of the church?
Yeah, good question. The question is, so when the believers lapsed the first time, how did they accept them back into the fold? So AD 250, a big controversy, like I said, arose. There's actually a Jewish, actually a Roman, a Presbyterian church called Novation. That was pretty hardline. It says, we can't take these guys back in the church. And so this, because the martyrs' sacrifice was so significant, they're like, how can we be in brotherhood with someone who apostatized and our brothers have died for the faith, right? So they struggled with it. And someone came up with a brilliant idea. Cyprian came with a brilliant idea. Cyprian actually went into hiding in Carthage. It was bishop of the church there. He was actually martyred later on, one of the names on the list. He said, okay, here's what we will do. We're going to establish a system of penance. You know, you can't just come back in and go, all right, I'm back in, let me in, and we're good with you. You're going to have to go through something to show your level of repentance. Be it a time of fasting, you got to do some amount of good deeds. And that became the theology. Cyprian also said, if you apostatize, you can't be a bishop, right? Now, the interesting thing about that, the church actually split at that point. There's a schism between the Novation Church and the Catholic body over this. The interesting thing about the entire knock-on consequence from that theology was that set in stone the theology for later on indulgences. Instead of indulgences, that became a big sting on the church in the medieval age. But it was in response to people like Cyprian trying to solve this problem. What do we do? Are we just going to be completely pure and holy, or is this going to be, as I think Calixtus said, a school for sinners as a church? And so, yeah, big issue. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I would say that a lot of times people tend to romanticize the first century church. I mean, and even just in our church, like we look at it and go, hey, this is our example. But we see that there were still plenty of issues in the church. There were still heresies they were dealing with. What are some things that you feel like we should learn from the mistakes, or like what are some of the mistakes that had to be learned the hard way from like first century or second century, or maybe some of the things that we can just do now that we now that we've seen their example, things that we should probably take away as individuals?
It's funny. So from a purely theological perspective, one of the big things that made a huge impression on me as I was going through church history is you never get good theology by reacting to bad theology.
Right.
I mean, you start in a bad place and go, well, this guy's got a bad theology. I'm just going to react to it, and I'm going to come up with something, and I'm going to be very, very reactionary. And that happened a lot. Now, sometimes it was hardly ever out of just malice. They were dealing with real problems. How do we deal with this? What's the context in which I'm going to view my time and my problems? And so I think context is so, so important. What's the context for the problems that I'm facing with today? The context for the problems that I'm dealing with today in my faith are different than the context that they were dealing with in the first, the second, the third, the 10th century, right? And so whenever we're facing a problem, we gotta prayerfully go to God and pray for God's wisdom and do it with a great deal of humility and a great deal of just grace with each other. I mean, that's the thing, grace with each other. One of the things they talked about was, they got one of the silly things that kind of came. Well, it's not silly. It's important. In the 2nd century, Polycarp and Anicetus had a disagreement about celebrating Easter. Big deal, right? That was what the early church, the year kind of celebrated around, or it was called Pascal, or the resurrection of Jesus. And one wanted to do it based on the Jewish Passover, and and the other wanted to do it, certain days after Passover. And so there's this big division. And in the end, Polycarp and Anicetus decided that let's agree to disagree, and we'll go our ways and we'll respect each other. Well, about 50 years later on, Victor, the Pope of Rome, there's a big council, and he gets really bad on shit about the position taken by Ephesus, and he goes, you know what, forget this, I'm going to excommunicate the entire church of Ephesus and its bishop, because you guys are celebrating Easter wrong. And eventually Irenaeus rebuked him and goes, calm down, Victor. Polycarp and Anicetus resolve this. Peace and amicably, don't overreact, have grace. And so, there are going to be disputable matters, and there are going to be matters we say we have a lot of grace with each other there. So be mindful of those things, and pray for God's wisdom to distinguish that.
All right.
All right, looks like you got